There's lots of little screens here. I feel like I'm driving a spaceship or something. And once I get it all up and ready, then we can kick off. But so guys, how you going today? I hope you're having a good Saturday. I am Jeff. I'm the winemaker for Tractorless Vineyard. We're a small boutique vineyard based in Barrel in the Southern Highlands. We run our vineyard all biodynamically. We run sheep through the vineyard for the whole growing season, which means we use the tractor about 60% less. So that's where our name comes from, Tractorless. You know, I have this ultimate goal to be really sustainable. And so, you know, one day I'd love to have a winery that's completely off the grid. We're slowly getting there. You know, we do a few things. These bottles we use are special low carbon bottles. So about half the carbon of a normal bottle. Got the solar on the winery. We run the biodynamics, of course, doing a little bit of work with some some geothermal people, and even this new technology that's out in Australia where they're converting bio waste into energy. So hopefully some of these new technologies will eventually get us all off the grid, which will be pretty exciting. But let's taste some wines because that's why we're here. So the first one we're going to have a look at is our Sauvignon Blanc. And then we're just going to work our way down that list until we eventually get to the bottom of the wine list. So Sauvignon Blanc, I'm actually normally not a massive fan of Sauvignon Blanc. I often find them really fruity and in your face and sometimes a little bit acidic. And so I've made this in what we call a fumé style. And a fumé style is essentially a Sauvignon Blanc that's fermented with oak. And what that oak does is a number of things. I guess the first thing you notice when you smell it is it's got that real vanilla-y lift to the nose. That's from the oak barrel. It almost appears like it's going to be a little bit sweet, but it's quite a dry wine just because of that vanilla-y lift. The two things that I really love about using oak in Sauvignon Blanc is one of them is you take all these intense sort of Sauvignon Blanc flavors and characters and you just mellow them out a little bit. So they're just a mellowed out version of those sort of really opulent Sauv Blanc flavors. That's one of the things I love about the oak. The other thing is just as those flavors are sort of slowly disappearing at the end of the palate, you get this beautiful mouthfeel. It's like a texture in the mouth. And I am a huge fan of texture. I love to be able to smell a wine. I love to be able to taste a wine. I also love to be able to really feel the wine in my mouth. And so, you know, as we go through our wines, you'll see that they are quite textural wines, and I'm a massive fan of them. And that's one of the things that I love about this style of Sauvignon Blanc is that nice texture that you get from the oak barrel. We actually do a couple of other interesting things with this Sauvignon Blanc. We do a double harvest. So we harvest half of it at 9 Baumé. Now, Baumé is a sugar level. There's a million different ways to measure sugar. There's like grams per liter and specific gravities and Oeschlers and Brixes and Baumés and there's all sorts of ones. I like to use Baumé because if I take 1 Baumé of sugar and I ferment it with yeast, I end up with 1% alcohol. So it's just a really easy, you can pretty much interchange them one for one. So we harvest half of these grapes at 9 Baumé, which will become 9% alcohol. And that gives us that nice, sort of a little bit of a crisp green apple character, gives us a bit of fresh acid. It gives us this sort of lantana edge to the wine. We then wait about 2 weeks. Sometimes it's a bit more, sometimes a bit less, depending on the weather of the season, until the second half of the fruit is at 13 Baumé. And then that gives us that nice passion fruit and tropical characters in the wine. All of the wine then, of course, goes into barrel. The barrel mellows out all those flavors. It gives us that nice texture. And so we end up with this, I guess, mellowed out textural version of a Sauvignon Blanc. It's a style we're starting to see a little bit more in Australia, partially because, you know, I think as Australian winemakers, we're trying to do something a little bit different to New Zealand. And we see all these really fruity, opulent styles out of New Zealand. And I think we want to do something a bit different here. So we're seeing them pop up a little bit more. I love this style. I like to think it represents my personality a little bit. It's kind of a mellowed out style. I kind of think I'm a fairly mellowed out guy. I'm sure my wife disagrees sometimes, but most of the time I think I'm fairly mellowed out. It's a really good example of how cold we are in the Southern Highlands, because to get that really passion fruity sort of character in a Sauvignon Blanc, you need to be quite a cool region. And people think, oh, Southern Highlands is just up there near Sydney, must be similar temperature to Sydney. Well, our lowest vineyard is at 500 meters. So we're actually quite a cool region. And some years we are harvesting after Tasmania. And, about a month ago, maybe a little bit more now, it was snowing down here. So we are a very cool climate region. And so varieties like Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Gris, Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, those cool climate varieties are what suit this region quite well. If you happen to have a Jarlsberg or an Edam or one of those nice softer Rhine cheeses in front of you, I find that is a really nice match with that Fumé style Sauvignon Blanc. We're quite well known down in this region for our Pinot Gris. I always get people coming into the cellar door asking me, what's the difference between Gris and Grigio? And so I decided to make the difference so we could taste it. And so for the next one we're going to look at then is our Pinot Grigio, and then we're going to move on to our Pinot Gris. So Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris are both made from the exact same grape variety. They're both made from the Pinot Gris grape variety. Grigio is the Italian way of doing it, and Gris is the French way of doing it. So to confuse us all completely, Pinot Gris is the name of the variety, but it is also the name of the style of making that variety from France. And so we get a bit of a double up there, which makes it a little bit confusing. The first big difference we see between these is actually the philosophy behind the winemaking. So the Italians, to an extent, we can say the Italians make a wine specifically for a food. It's not 100% true, but the Italians are definitely very conscious of food when they're making wine. The French, on the other hand, the wine is all about the wine. It doesn't mean that they match any less with food. It just means that they're approaching the winemaking from quite different ends of the spectrum. So we end up with these two really quite different styles. If you think of Italy, warmer climate, a lot of maritime areas, a lot of seafood. And so the Italians are trying to create something that's fresh and zippy and crisp and steely. And so the first thing the Italians do is they harvest it nice and early, because when we ripen a grape, our sugar levels are increasing and our acid levels are decreasing. And so if we want to create a wine that's nice and fresh, we harvest it nice and early so that we've got that higher level of natural acid. So that's the first thing the Italians do. And so normally a Grigio is around about that 11 to 12% alcohol, so slightly lower percentage in the alcohol. Second thing the Italians do, not afraid of oxygen at all. So when I make this wine, I actually press off all the juice into a tank, and then I fill a bucket from the bottom of that tank, and I tip it in the top, and I fill it from the bottom, and I tip it in the top. And I might do that 10, 20 times until all of that juice goes brown from the oxygen. And then I do a long, slow, cold ferment. And that long, slow, cold ferment and that oxygen in that juice helps gives me a little bit of a green apple character. It helps stabilize some of my aroma compounds. But one of the main things it helps me do, which is what I'm trying to create in this Italian Grigio style, is it helps give me that really steely palate. And if you're wondering what I mean by steely palate, have a look around you or have a look around your house, find a bit of stainless steel and give it a lick. Now, I don't make a point of going around the place licking things, especially at the moment during COVID, but that feeling when you lick a bit of stainless steel is what I'm talking about. It's not really a flavor. It's kind of a sensation. It's kind of got a metallic-y sensation on the tongue, but it's quite a clean metallic-y sensation. It's not like a bit of iron or something. But that's what I mean when I'm saying that steely character on the palate. And it's a character we traditionally see in a lot of these Grigio styles that we're trying to represent. One of the, I guess, difficult things, and to an extent, it's a little bit of a problem with Pinot Grigios, and I find it's the same with a lot of Italian styles, is they're really hard to taste in a wine tasting situation or a situation where you don't have much time and food with you. Because they are designed to go so well with food, you know, you only really get a snippet of what they have to offer. You know, so when we taste this now, we're getting apples and pears and a little bit of stone fruit and a lot of those fruity flavors, but we're not really seeing any sort of cheesiness or yeastiness or biscuity or any of those yeasty flavors in this wine. One of my favorite matches with our Grigio is actually fresh oysters. And when you match it with a fresh oyster, all of a sudden you get these beautiful, cheesy, lanolin, yeasty characters coming from that wine. You think, where was that? Because I can taste this wine now and there's none of those flavors in it at all. But when I have it with an oyster, all of a sudden all these flavors are coming out. And it's a perfect example of what these Italian styles often do. They have all this hidden flavor that comes out at different times with different food or with different temperatures. If you take that Grigio and sit it on your table and taste it at different temperatures and taste it with different foods for the rest of the evening, you'll probably find that the flavor profile of that wine really changes quite a bit. And so, you know, every time you look at it, you see another flavor and you see another flavor and you see another flavor. And that's what these styles quite often do. But it makes them so hard to judge. You know, we're here today looking at all these different wines. We'll see this wine for, you know, a minute or two, and then we've moved on to the next wine. So we really don't get to appreciate all these hidden flavors that these wines have to offer. What we might do is duck across to our Gris, because it actually makes it a little bit easier for me to explain these hidden flavors if I've got something to compare it to. So that wine was our Grigio. That's the Italian style. It's harvested early, 11, 12% alcohol. It has a cold ferment, has lots of oxygen in the ferment, and it's creating this more fresh, zippy, crisp style of wine. Pinot Gris, which is the next wine we're going to taste. Pinot Gris, if you think about Pinot Gris in France, most of the Pinot Gris is grown in Alsace, which is on the French-German border. So it's a cooler region. The French winemakers, the wine is all about the wine. And so they're trying to create something that's big and round and robust, voluptuous and like viscous, and it's got a lot of mouthfeel to it. So the first thing the French do is they let it ripen a lot more. One, so we get a bit more of those fleshy flavors, but also because it gives us a higher amount of alcohol, and that alcohol really gives us a nice warm, round feeling in the mouth. So the French are usually waiting to about 13 to 14 Beaumet or 13, 14% alcohol to harvest their grapes, which means it's usually about 4 weeks later than the Italians. And as a result, the first thing we see when we look at that wine is that color difference. It's got a real sort of like a bronzy color to it. And sometimes we even see a little bit of a pinky tinge. And that's from that ripeness level, because the Pinot Gris grape is a really interesting white grape variety. It's one of the only white grape varieties in the world that when it gets very ripe, it actually starts turning red. And so when we get to sort of high 12s, early 13s, the skins on the Pinot Gris start going pink. And it's actually where the name came from, because if you had to have all these little pink berries hanging on a bunch, and that bunch is out in the vineyard, it gets a light dusting on the outside. And from a distance, the bunches actually look gray. And the French word for grey is gris. So Pinot, because it's related to Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, and Gris because the bunches look grey. Now the Italians, they never get that flavor, that color development. So because they're harvesting it at 11, 12% alcohol, a Pinot Gris always has that more traditional white wine color. It's more of a greeny color. Because Pinot Grigio then. Now I'm even confusing myself. So Pinot Grigio always has that greeny color. Because we're ripening Pinot Gris a lot more, we're getting that color development. And so traditional French Gris normally have that bronzy color to it. And in Australia, quite often that bronzy color will develop a little bit more, and we start to see like a pinky color in the wine. And if any of you do drink a lot of Pinot Gris at all, you probably would have in your time had a pink Pinot Gris, and that's probably because it's from a slightly warmer region, and those warmer regions really develop that color a little bit more. So that's the first big difference we see. The next thing you see, if you look at your glass really carefully, just about here, you get a rim of clear liquid, and you see it dribbling back down into the wine. And we call this the legs of the wine. And what it is everything volatile. So everything in that wine that can evaporate out at room temperature, it evaporates out, it condensates on the glass around here, and it dribbles back down into the wine. Now, this is predominantly alcohol. So the reason we don't see this as much with the Grigio is because the alcohol is quite low. Whereas with the Gris, the alcohol is 13 to 14%. So we usually always see this legs line around the glass. And this alcohol actually does something really interesting in the wine. If you give your glass a little bit of a swirl and then a good smell, you'll probably agree with me that the Pinot Gris appears to be a lot more aromatic. There seems to be a lot of flavor jumping out of that glass. The interesting thing is, if I was to scientifically analyze the aroma compounds of the Gris and the aroma compounds of the Grigio's actually got loads more. And what's happening is, as that alcohol is evaporating out of that wine, it's grabbing onto all the other aroma compounds at the same time, and it's pulling them out of that wine with it. And so when we smell it, we're getting hit with all the aroma compounds all at once. If you were to take the Gris and leave it on your desk and taste it with different foods and taste it with different temperatures throughout the afternoon, it really wouldn't change that much. What we see is what we get. And this is one of the biggest differences between these two wines. Gris is, hey, look at me. This is everything I have to offer. Grigio is really shy and a bit more reserved, and it's sort of showing you one thing, and then it needs the change in food, and it shows you another thing, and it needs a change in temperature, and then it shows you another thing. And it's one of the big differences between the two styles. The reason for this is because we're not actually tasting these flavors. So we're not tasting a peach, we're not tasting a pear, we're not tasting these cheesy flavors, we're actually smelling them. So when I eat a peach, when I'm chewing it and I swallow it, some of the aroma compounds of that peach become airborne, and I detect them in my nasal passage, because my tongue only actually has the ability to taste sweetness, sourness, bitterness, saltiness, and umami, which is MSG. So when we think we're tasting these flavors, we're actually smelling them. So for us to be able to, in inverted commas, taste a flavor, it needs to be airborne. In the case of the Gris, everything is being made airborne by that alcohol. In the case of the Grigio, because of the winemaking techniques we use, a lot of those aroma compounds are stabilized in the wine. And so we need a change in temperature or a change in chemical structure to make those aromatic compounds airborne. And that's why when I have it with an oyster, for example, an oyster changes the chemical structure of the wine, which causes the wine to release those cheesy aromatic compounds and those lanolin yeasty aromatic compounds. And that's the reason why we see that, you know, Italian style releasing all these flavors at different times. And if you think about how the Italians traditionally eat, you know, they have quite a spread out meal with really quite a lot of different components. You know, they've got antipasta, and then they've got their mains, and what do they call it? Primo, primindi, or whatever it's called, and secondi, and 30, or whatever they're called. But there's a lot of different meals, a lot of different times. So if you were to drink a bottle of Grigio across that period, it's evolving with the food, and it really is giving you different flavors with the food. So it really kind of suits the way they eat. The last big thing we notice when we taste the Gris, it's big, it's round, it's voluptuous, and it's got this viscosity to it, this kind of oily viscosity. And that's one of the key things we're trying to create or look for in a traditional French style Gris, is that viscosity. And what that viscosity is if I ferment a grape at a warm temperature, I create glycerols, and glycerols give me that beautiful, round, oily sort of mouthfeel. And this is one of the balancing acts that we're always playing as a winemaker. Nice cold ferments give us high aromatics, but not many glycerols, so not much mouthfeel. Nice warm ferments give us lots of glycerols, but not many aromatics. And so we're always playing this balancing act of sort of aromatics and glycerol-y mouthfeel, and aromatics and glycerol-y mouthfeel. For Grigios and Gris, it's easy. We just made two completely different styles. So you've got the Italian style, high amount of aromatics, but low amount of glycerols. You've got the French style, it's got high amount of glycerols, but low amount of aromatics. So what the French are doing to try and trap in some of those aromatics, they do everything under carbon dioxide cover. So they don't let oxygen near that wine at all. And the idea is that tries to trap in a few more of those aromatics. So we end up with these two really different styles. You've got the French style, you've got the Italian style, which is harvested early, fermented cold, lots of oxygen in the ferment at this end of the spectrum. You got your French style that's harvested late. It's a warmer ferment and no oxygen in it at all at this end of the spectrum. Now, these two wines are from the exact same vineyard, exact same block, and the only difference is about 4 weeks harvest and the way we make the wine. And so it's amazing how different they are, and it's a really good example of what the winemaker can do and what the viticulturist can do to, I guess, affect the final product. And go chuck a little poll up. This is one of the coolest things I worked out how to do on these little Zoom webinars, is I can do polling and see what everyone thinks. It's interesting. Pinot Gris and Grigios, I always get couples coming into the cellar door, and I always get one of them liking one and one of them like the other. So they always disagree, which is fine by me, because it means that I sell them 2 bottles of wine instead of one. So it's no problem at all when everyone disagrees. So I don't mind at all. Pinot Gris and Grigios are great wines to remember when you're trying to find a match for spicy food. So, you know, it's always really quite difficult to match a wine to spicy food. And these are my go-to. And so if I'm having like Vietnamese or Thai or those fresher kind of spicy foods, I usually go the Grigio. If I'm having Indian or some of those more round, robust styles of spicy food, I usually go with the Gris. And so they're really good wines to remember for those spicy foods. If you happen to have like a harder rind cheese, like a Manchego or something, I find that's a really nice match with the Grigio. With the Gris, it would probably go quite well with a Brie or something. It's, for some reason, I don't really drink it much with cheese, and so I couldn't offer you a really good match with the Gris. Normally, I end up my default sort of match, which was a surprise one day, is I was having sashimi with wasabi, and when I had that with the Gris, the Gris and the wasabi mix. I think the Gris made the wasabi taste a lot sweeter, and I really liked the way it did that to it, and so that was actually one of my favorite matches for that Gris. So that's Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris. What about Chardonnays? Do we have many Chardonnay drinkers on the webinar today? And I love asking this question because I'm going to preempt the results, and I'll see how close I am. Normally, I get about 20% of people saying yes, and about 80% of people saying no. It varies a little bit, but that's on average what I get. So we'll see how we go today. So today we've got 60% of people saying no, and 40% of people saying yes. So we got more Chardonnay drinkers. So that's exciting for me because I am on this mission to make Chardonnay cool again. So I think it's funny because, you know, our percentages of people that say yes are always the lowest. But the biggest selling white variety in Australia and the biggest selling white variety in our cellar door is Chardonnay. And so maybe those 20% of people that say yes do a lot of Chardonnay drinking. I'm not sure. Maybe in the 80% that say no, we have all these closet Chardonnay drinkers. Maybe Kath and Kim scared everyone away from admitting they drink Chardonnay. I actually think a lot of it is to do with the history of Chardonnay. You know, we went from the 70s and the 80s where we had these really oaky style Chardonnays and these buttery style Chardonnays. And then we went to sort of late 90s, early 2000s where we had all these unoaked styles of Chardonnay. And we all have a memory of something that's too oaky, too buttery, too fruity, not fruity enough, not oaky enough, not buttery enough. And so we're all a little bit unsure and a bit, I guess, maybe jaded, but definitely unsure of Chardonnay. And I think that's why we get that funny breakdown of people who say yes to drinking Chardonnay. For me personally, Chardonnay is all about balance. So I want to see a bit of oak. I want to see a bit of butteriness. I want to see a bit of fruit. But I don't want any one of those characters to overpower and shadow any one of the other flavors. And so that's what I'm looking for when I'm making a Chardonnay and when I'm drinking a Chardonnay. And when you taste this Chardonnay, you sort of go through those flavors. You start off with this nice little bit of vanilla oak. I don't use any new oak. I find that the first year is a little bit splintery and a little bit over the top and powerful and like a bit clumsy, I guess. And so I usually use 1, 2, and 3-year-old oak. You get a little lick of butteriness before it goes into sort of mangoes and grapefruits and that nice citrusy finish. But the key is the intensity of all those flavors are quite similar and quite balanced. So it's going oaky, buttery, mangoey, grapefruity, citrusy. It's not going oaky, buttery, mangoey, grapefruity. It's that nice balance. And that's the thing that I'm looking for when I'm making a Chardonnay, is that nice balance. And, you know, I've got no problems with super oaky Chardonnays as long as you've got intense butteriness and intense fruit characters to match that oak. You know, I don't mind if you have super fruity Chardonnays as long as you have the balance of all those other flavors in there so they balance out. That's what I'm really looking for. And part of the reason that I want to make Chardonnay cool again or bring it back into the limelight is I actually think Australia as a whole is making some of the best Chardonnays that we've ever made. You know, I've been making wine now 24 years. I've made oaky wines. I've made buttery wines. I've made fruity wines. And now I'm getting my head around that nice natural balance. And I think a lot of winemakers have gone through that same sort of progression and that learning experience. And we are seeing fantastic Chardonnays hitting the market now. And I believe some of the best we've ever seen in Australia. And I think it's a little bit of a shame that we're not talking about them as much. One, for two reasons. One, because I think they deserve to be talked about because they're fantastic Chardonnays, but also because I think the more we talk about these great balanced styles, the more we'll actually see those great balanced styles, because it will influence other winemakers who haven't gone through that journey to start thinking about it and looking at it a bit. You know, I know a lot of you guys are down in Victoria, and you're lucky down there. You've got Mornington Peninsula, you've got the Yarra Valley, you've got the Geelong, three great regions that are really putting out some great Chardonnays there around you. I know some of the wineries down there, like Pulpit Rock and not Pulpit Rock, what's it called? Pulpero and Even Keel. They do a great Chardonnay from Tumbarumba, and that's one of my favourite regions up here in New South Wales. Tumbarumba, our region, Southern Highlands, and Orange are probably one of my three favourite up here in this region. Those nice, cool climate ones. So we are really seeing these great balanced styles, and that's why I'm on the Bring Chardonnay Back. I'm going to get a cap made. I think it's going to say make Chardonnay cool again or something. If you happen to have a Brie, that is a great match with this Chardonnay. And what I love about it is it doesn't matter how creamy your Brie is. That Chardonnay, those mango-y and those buttery flavors of the Chardonnay will just come and match that level. No matter where that level is, it will just match it. And it never sort of goes higher and never sort of goes lower. It just sort of always matches it. And I think it's really cool how the Chardonnay manages to match the creamy levels of the cheese every time. Also a great match with that more oily fish, so like salmon or lobster or crab, or those sort of seafoody characters. So the next one we're going to taste is our semi-dry Riesling. And we actually do two Rieslings. We do a dry Riesling and we do a semi-dry Riesling. And I was tossing up which one to include in the tasting. And I thought, you know, we get to try so many great examples of a dry Riesling in Australia. We see lots of them. We don't see as often these great examples of these German style sweeter Rieslings. And so that's why I wanted to include this one in the tasting. I find that generally a lot of the sweeter wines in Australia are made by bigger companies. And when I'm consulting to a big company and I'm fermenting, say, a 20,000 litre batch of Riesling or something that's going to be a sweet wine, 20,000 litres, that ferment is so strong, it's almost unstoppable. It's like me standing in front of a semi-trailer like this trying to stop it. It's just not going to happen. And so what I do when I'm making big batches like that is I ferment it dry and then I back add the sweetness. And when I'm back adding the sweetness, I end up with a slightly more caramelized, sugary sweetness to the wine. If I'm making it in a more traditional German style, I can only do smaller batches. So I can only do about 3,000 to 5,000 litres at a time. I start them fermenting. And when the sweetness level is where I want it, I chill it and filter it and stop the ferment. And so I'm retaining that natural sweetness of the grape rather than adding the sweetness. And so that gives us a more sort of juicy, lush sweetness to the wine. It's a little bit, you know, when you bite into an apple tastes quite crisp and fresh, but an apple actually has quite a high level of sweetness to it. And it's because of the types of sugars and the percentage of the different types of sugars and the types of acids and the percentage of the different types of the acids and the way the two of them interact that we get this fresh, crisp character. And it's exactly the same if we can maintain that balance from the natural sweetness of the grape. We get that better interaction. And so we get a more lush, juicy sweetness rather than a caramelized sweetness. And this Riesling, it's quite a sweet Riesling. So in the ranking of like German ranking of sweet Rieslings, this is sort of just before it becomes a dessert wine. So it is quite a sweet wine. I made it deliberately like that because I wanted to demonstrate how, if made in these more traditional styles, it can a really sweet wine can still be quite a juicy, lush wine. And you know, in Australia, we taste a sweeter wine like that, and we immediately put it towards dessert, or we immediately put it down, match it with some cheeses or something like that at the end of a meal. I actually think on a nice warm day, beautifully chilled, this wine is a great match, a great aperitif. Match it with some antipasta, or match it with a nice Waldorf salad, something with a little bit of fruit and maybe some cheese in that salad is a really great start to a meal, just to cleanse that palate and get things rolling on a nice warm day. And so for me, I'm like quite excited that we're starting to get a little bit of warm weather, because it means I can start pulling out some of these white wines, because I know about you guys, but it has definitely been very cold down here in the Southern Highlands over the last couple of months. And so I've been drinking red wines mainly. So that's all our white wines for today. As I said, it has been cold down here in the Highlands. So normally you can find me sitting on the couch in front of the open fire with a nice bottle of red. And so the first red we're going to taste tonight is called the Lost Flock. And the Lost Flock, I was sitting in front of the fire at home and I was drinking a big Barossa red. And I love a Barossa red. They have that velvety tannin and those chocolate notes and those raspberry notes. I just find that sometimes they're a little bit heavy. I can have a glass or two and they're a little bit over the top. And so I wanted to create something that was a bit more delicate, a bit more cool climate like, that I could drink a bottle of in front of the fire. Not that I'm telling anyone to drink a bottle in front of the fire by themselves, but that might have been a little bit of I guess an idea or inspiration, I guess, to making this wine. It's essentially a GSM, Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre, but it also has a little bit of Merlot and Petit Verdot. And this is just our everyday, easy drinking red. It's got that nice velvety tannin, that chocolate character, that long raspberry aftertaste. It's a wine I drink a lot of, a little bit by default. Do you remember back in the days when we were allowed to have dinner parties? Back in the days when we were allowed to have dinner parties, I usually always took a blend, and it was usually always this blend because, someone likes Shiraz, someone likes Merlot, someone likes Grenache. Well, if you take a blend, everyone can flavor that they like. It's a wine that's actually really special to us, and that's because of the name, the Lost Flock. And when you decide to go biodynamic or organic, you're doing it from a really philosophical point of view. Because if you were to create a Shiraz, for example, and put it in the marketplace, the market may say value that at $30. If you were to make a biodynamic organic Shiraz and put it in the marketplace, the market will still only value it at $30. So we don't get any increase in value for being biodynamic or organic. It's starting to change a little bit, but at the moment, it's about the same. The problem with growing the vineyard biodynamically organically is it's actually a really expensive way to grow the grapes. And our biggest expense is actually managing the grass, because if I'm an industrial vineyard, it's easy. I just herbicide the grass, or I herbicide strips underneath the grapevines so that I just have to mow in between. For biodynamics and organics, we don't want to herbicide. So we spend a lot of money cultivating and mulching and whippersnipping and managing that grass under the grapevines. In 2013, we had a caterpillar problem in our vineyard. And the biodynamic philosophy says that if you have insect problems on your land, it's because you don't have enough animals. And so we started experimenting with sheep. And first, I got Dorpers. I thought, Dorpers, they're going to be perfect. They're fairly easy to look after. They're wool sheds, so you don't have to worry about shearing them. So I thought, yep, Dorpers. So we got these Dorpers. Well, a Dorper is pretty much like a goat, and they ate half the vineyard. And so that experiment did not work well at all. I grew up on a sheep farm, and I grew up on a merino farm. And merinos are what we call grazing sheep. So a Dorper is a browsing sheep, which means they look everywhere for food and they'll just eat it. A Merino is a grazing sheep. So it means they only look inside their feeding zone for food and they don't look outside of their feeding zone until they've eaten everything in their feeding zone. So the Merinos, they kind of worked. The grapevine sat here, which was outside of their feeding zone. The bunches hung down just inside their feeding zone. But what we did is we ran 2 electrical wires under the bunches, which stopped them from eating the grapes. The problem that year was when the electricity went out for 2 hours, it's amazing how many grapes a Merino can eat in 2 hours. So we lost a lot of grapes that year, but we were getting closer. Eventually, we found a rare breed of sheep called a Hampshire Down. They're a breed from the UK. They're a grazing sheep, the same as a Merino. You can sort of see them in the background of my photo there. They look a little bit like a Suffolk. A Suffolk is a lot taller, and a Suffolk, the whole head is black in a Suffolk, but with the Hampshire Down, it's just the face. So they're a grazing sheep like a Merino. But the biggest difference between a Merino and a Hampshire Down is a Hampshire Down is 2 inches shorter. And so with a Merino, the grape bunches sat here inside of their feeding zone. With a Hampshire Down, they're outside of their feeding zone. And so what it means is we can run these sheep underneath the vineyard for the entire growing season. Now, this has solved our caterpillar problem. And I don't know why I didn't think about it at the time, but I was so obsessed with fixing this caterpillar problem, but I didn't think that sheep eat grass. And so the most expensive part of managing our vineyard is now done for free by the sheep. And so the sheep have taken something that is a really expensive philosophical way to run a vineyard, and our costs now are about the same as a normal industrial vineyard. But we're becoming really good with the sheep. And there's a process that we do every year that we call leaf plucking. And what it is, if you can imagine a bunch of grapes hanging down like this, and what happens, the leaves grow over the top and shade the bunches. And so it stops the sunlight. And in a cool climate region, we want the sunlight to penetrate those bunches because it helps us with disease control and it helps us with flavor development as well. And so usually every year we get teams and teams of people to literally walk down the rows, ripping off the leaves around the bunches to expose all the fruit. What we worked out at a really specific time of the year, when the berries are hard and green and the shoots have lignified. So what that means is if you have a shoot that's young and you grab a leaf and pull it, it rips the whole shoot off. If you wait for that shoot to lignify and you grab a leaf and pull it, it only rips the leaf off. So it's usually around about January every year. And what we do is we put the sheep in the block as normal and we run them in quite small blocks so that the sheep will eat down that block in about 3 or 4 days. Normally, we would then move them into the next block. But at this really specific time of the year, when the berries are hard and green and the shoots are lignified, we leave the sheep in that block. If they've run out of food in their feeding zone, they actually start looking elsewhere for food. And they eat the first two leaves off the grapevine. And they do all our leaf plucking for us. And it looks amazing. It looks like someone's gone through a ruler just above the bunches like this and just cut off all the leaves. It's fantastic. So now our biodynamic vineyards with the sheep are actually far cheaper to run than a normal industrial vineyard. But the Hampshire Downs get even better than that. A Hampshire Down is what we call a roaming sheep. So a Merino and a Dorper, they flock. And so you end up with these sheep camps where all the manure is in one spot, where there's no grass in that spot. They then follow each other through the vineyard so that you end up with these tracks of compaction through the vineyard. Because a Hampshire Down's a roaming sheep, you don't have any of these problems. So it's fantastic for the vineyard. You don't get compaction. You don't get these sheep camps. It's an absolute nightmare when I go to shear because there's always one sheep out in a paddock somewhere, hiding somewhere, and I always end up with one woolly sheep wandering around the vineyard. And it reminded me, when I make this wine, I stack all the Shiraz barrels in one stack and all the Merlot barrels in one stack. and all the Grenache barrels in one stack. And those stacks are always scattered all over the winery. And it reminded me of the sheep being spread out all over the vineyard. And so that's my very long story on why we call this wine the Lost Flock. But the sheep are fundamental in everything we do now. You know, there's a reason they feature on all of our labels is because they've taken something that is a really costly way of running a vineyard, and they have now made it a really cheap way to run a vineyard. They have added the income of wool, they've added the income of meat. They could potentially add the income, which we're working on, of carbon credits, because of the way we manage the sheep. It's a lot more regenerative for our soils. And so we're sequestering a lot more carbon in our soils than the normal way we'd manage the vineyard. And so the sheep are part of the reason we're also so sustainable. They're saving us 60% on the tractor. They're helping us with these regenerative, sustainable soils. So they really are fundamental in everything we do. And I could rabbit on for the rest of the afternoon about sheep and regenerative farming, but we're here to taste wine, so I'm not going to. But the sheep are very important to us. That is our Lost Flock, a wine that I do drink a fair bit of, but not my favorite. And I know as a parent, you're not meant to have, I guess, your favorite child, but the next wine is my secret favorite child, and that's our Reserve Pinot. And so our Reserve Pinot, we only make the Reserve Pinot once every about 4 or 5 years. We need all the conditions to be quite specific. Every other year, we make our regular standard Pinot. It's made in much the same way that we see a lot of Pinots across Australia and New Zealand and America, in that real contemporary techniques. It produces these beautiful, bright, vibrant red fruits and this delicate palate and this interesting complexity. For some reason, they always remind me of ballerinas. You know, they're complex and interesting, but at the same time really delicate and bright on the palate. What we don't get to see as often in Australia are those old school funky Burgundian styles. And so that's how we make our Reserve. Loads of whole bunches, loads of stems. When I first put it into bottle, it's undrinkable. It's bitter and resiny and stemsy, and it actually needs about 4 years in bottle to really settle down. And if you've been lucky enough to travel over to Burgundy in France, you'll know that you really can't buy a Pinot in the cellar door there that's under about 3 or 4 years old. And that's because they use these same techniques. And it produces a Pinot that's big and funky and mushroomy and forest flory and cigar boxy. So traditionally we'd match a Pinot with maybe a duck or a pheasant. I find these big funky styles, a better match might be like venison or kangaroo. They can just handle that little bit of like heavier meats. I love this style. My accountant hates this style. We spend all this money making it, and then I put it into storage for 4 years before we sell it. So he hates it, but I love it, so he doesn't get a say in it. It creates these big styles that are designed to age and age and age and age. That's the whole idea behind these styles. You may notice a little bit of cloudiness in your wine. This is one of our more natural wines. It's all unfiltered. It's all vegan. It's some old school winemaking. It's old school funky winemaking. And I love this style. I think it's a great example of this style. And definitely one that we will probably hold back and do some museum releases to our club members, because I really like to experience old wines with people. So it's one that we will stop selling one day and hold it back. All of our wines up until now have been made using quite European techniques. And I said that I love texture in my wines. And so I just find that those slightly more European techniques give me a little bit more texture in the wine. The problem with using those techniques is when I put them into bottle, they take a lot longer to settle down. And so, you know, they're probably taking 18 to 24 months at a minimum before they're ready to be sold. At a maximum, we've got things like the Pinot and the Cabernet. Pinot's 4 years before it's really ready to be sold. If I'm making a wine with more contemporary, I guess, Australian techniques, we create these wines that have beautiful, vibrant fruit. They're more fruit-driven wines, but they're delicate and vibrant. The advantage to them is that I can put them into bottle and they're ready to drink within a month or two. The disadvantage of them is they have a little bit less texture to them. But the next wine that we're tasting is our Shiraz. And I've made that with these more contemporary Australian techniques. And I had to do a Shiraz. The first job I ever had when I finished school was with a winery called Clonakilla in Canberra. And they're very famous for their cool climate Shiraz. They're responsible, I guess, for creating my love in winemaking and getting me on my winemaking journey. They're responsible for implanting, I guess, Shiraz in my winemaking journey. And so I had to do a Shiraz. I had to do a Shiraz because Australia's famous for Shiraz. Like, one of the reasons we're known around the world is because of our Shiraz variety. It's one of the first varieties we became known for. So I had to do a Shiraz. And I really wanted to do it in a contemporary Australian techniques. And part of that was because if you said to me today, Jeff, what is a wine that you think is, I guess, the icon wine for contemporary Australia? And I would pick a cool climate Shiraz, definitely for the reds anyway. I think that this sort of is a wine that we're really quite well renowned for around the world. It's a wine that we all drink that is in a beautiful, delicate style. I love this style, and so that's why I had to make it in that more contemporary wine techniques. The funny thing about these techniques is that, about the Australian Shiraz, I mean, is I've tried all these other techniques. I've tried these like old school Rhone Valley techniques with stems and skins, and I've tried these cutting edge Californian techniques where we're cold macerating before ferment and things like that. And I just find that Australian Shiraz doesn't want to be fiddled with, kind of wants to be left alone. And so the most easy hands-off winemaking is what we use for this Shiraz. We de-stem it, we ferment it without the stems for 3 weeks. It goes into oak for 12 to 18 months and then into bottle. Really easy winemaking, but it just works. And one of the things that I love about cool climate Shiraz is the structure. So when you taste this wine, think about where the acid is and think about where that tanniny grip is. And what you get right down the middle of the tongue, you get this beautiful line of acid and this beautiful line of tannin texture. And what that does is create structure around the wine. And that structure, if you think about a warm climate Shiraz that doesn't have that structure, gets all this intense complex flavor, and it just sort of goes, there you go. And it gives it to you all at once. And you're just like, bang, wow, that's amazing, but all at once. Cool climate Shiraz has all this intense complex structure, intense complex flavor, but because of that structure, kind of just hands you those flavors and just keeps handing it to you. And that's what I love about these styles. It's just the way they give you these flavors. Nice, delicate way of giving the flavors. If you drink a lot of cool climate Shiraz, this is exactly what you'd expect to get, and you would not be disappointed. It is a very typical cool climate Shiraz. I find that the thing I'm looking for in those Shirazes is that structure. And I find Canberra, Heathcote, and Young are the 3 regions on the East Coast here that consistently give you that structure. And so we work very closely with some growers in Young, and that's where we get our fruit from for the Shiraz, because it's far too cold in the Highlands to grow Shiraz. And that's why it comes under our Creators label. So we have our Sustainable series, which is 100% off our biodynamic blocks. And we've got our Creators series, which is not 100% off our biodynamic blocks or not off our biodynamic blocks. And we really want to define that. So Creators series is from other blocks or partially from other blocks. I have a question here about at biodynamics, and that potentially has heard that there's a downside, that sometimes the variation can be a little bit big in biodynamics. I find that if I was to look at the history of biodynamic wines and the history of organic wines, I would 100% agree with you. They have a very bad rap. And I think some of the early day organic wines and biodynamic wines were created by people that were passionate about biodynamics and organics, but their knowledge was about the vineyard and the land, which is essentially where biodynamics and organics is done. And they didn't have the knowledge in winemaking. And so we did see a lot of inconsistent, a lot of quite variable wines from biodynamics and organics. Approaching it from the other point of view, my background is winemaking, who's then gone into the fruit side of it. So, you know, my first role is consulting and working for big companies. And I'd walk into one of their vineyards and I'd look at the grapes and say, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like this, I want you to do this, I want you to do that. And then I'd walk out and leave it up to the viticulturist to deal with. And when I started having to deal with it myself, because I was also the viticulturist, I started looking at, hang on, one, I'm reading this spray and I do not want to be anywhere near this. And so I started questioning that viticulture side of it. And now that I've learned the biodynamics in the vineyard, I actually find that I probably get a better consistency. The biggest issue is that I think it's more to do with there has been, no, that's not true. So nowadays we do have a lot of research and development in biodynamics and organics. When I started, which was 2012, 13, so what's that, 9 years, there was very little knowledge around. So if I had a problem in the vineyard, I'd call around Wine Australia, all these other firms that give wineries and vineyards advice, and they would only have a non-biodynamic solution for me. Nowadays, if I call up someone and ask about biodynamics or organics, or have a problem in the vineyard, there's a lot more research that's gone into it and a lot more money that's gone behind it. And so I can get a lot better advice. And so I think what we're finding now is the variability that you mentioned is a result of that lack of knowledge or lack of knowledge base that was easily accessible in Australia, rather than being from the actual principles themselves. Because I actually find now, and 2017 is a really good example, in our region, 2017 was one of the wettest, coldest harvest periods we've seen in a long time. So we had a really warm summer. We came into March, which is our harvest period, and we had literally had 30 days straight of rain. About 90 to 95% of the whole region did not harvest a single grape. And that was because everyone got botrytis in the vineyard, which is one of the diseases we can get in a vineyard. Now, a non-biodynamic vineyard, if they're managing botrytis, they spray a systemic spray. And if you get a rain event, you have to respray the systemic spray. To respray it, you need a couple of days of sun. So in a season like 2017, we didn't get that couple of days of sun. And so all these industrial vineyards just all got botrytis. For biodynamics, we spend a lot of time cultivating natural bacteria, and we actually spray on, it's a trichoderma, which is a fungus that outcompetes the bacteria that outcompetes the botrytis. And it doesn't work for the first 3 years. Well, it kind of works, but you're building up your natural levels in your vineyard. So eventually you've got this natural sort of resistance against botrytis. So 2014, we'd hit that natural resistance level. And because it was raining and raining and raining, all the botrytis is trying to grow, botrytis is trying to go, but it's the same conditions to grow a trichoderma. So our trichoderma is growing and our trichoderma is growing. And in 2017, we actually did not get any disease at all in our biodynamic blocks, but we definitely got a lot of disease in our non-biodynamic blocks. And it was a really big eye-opener to me at how sustainable and how, I guess, consistent biodynamics, I would say biodynamics a lot more than organic would be. And I say that because to be organic, it's just about not applying man-made sprays. That's all. To be biodynamic, you have to follow all the principles of biodynamics. And when you're following the principles of biodynamics, you're really conscious of the health of the soil and the health of the species of your grass and the whole health of the ecosystem. So I can walk into any of our biodynamic blocks in that year in 2017. If we had that much year being non-biodynamic, you can't even drive in the vineyard, you just bog and sink. In our biodynamic blocks, you just drive straight through, no problems at all. And that's because the soil structure is so good that it acts like a beautiful sponge, and all the water goes in and it dissipates the water, and you don't end up with any marshiness. And so there's all these other benefits of biodynamics that I think really give you that consistency. So I hope that answers the question. So yes, I can see why there is this idea that there is a lack of consistency from the quality of wines in the past. But I think that now that we have the knowledge behind it, now that a lot more winemakers that are winemaking trained are actually making those biodynamic wines, we definitely do see that consistency. And a really great example, yes, they're not biodynamic, but they do a lot of organic stuff and low sulfur stuff, is Tamburlaine. Like Tamburlaine is putting out some beautiful, consistent wines. And that's because they've got growers that just know organics, and they're running their vineyards organics, but you've got separate winemakers that are just making wine. And so you've got the experts and the experts, rather than a non-expert and an expert and a non-expert and an expert. And so it's that knowledge base, I think. And in the wine industry, biodynamics in particular are really getting picked up quite quickly. Anyone I know in the wine industry that does any sort of trial on biodynamics, they convert, because they all see the benefits straight away. And I, as the same as a winemaker, I can see the extra structure and texture in my wines, and I'm an absolute convert to biodynamics. So we've got two more wines. These are two interesting ones to end on. The first one is our post-Mac Cabernet Sauvignon. And I was really lucky when I was at uni, because there was about 6 people in my uni degree doing winemaking. And 2 years after me, there was about 200 people. But it meant I got to try some amazing wines at uni, because Nick Bulliard, who's one of our lecturers, could just grab a bottle and bring it in, and the 6 of us could taste it. When there's 200 people, you know, we had to make sure we had enough wine for 200 people. So I got to try some amazing wines. And one of the wines that has always stuck out in my memory was a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So it was a 46-year-old McGill's Burgundy. The McGill vineyard is one of the original Penfolds vineyard down in Adelaide. And this wine was just amazing. It just blew my mind. And ever since that day, I've been obsessed with making a wine that's going to age and age and age and age. You know, I wanted to make a wine that's going to age 50 to 100 years. And so when you look around the world at who's famous for creating a wine that ages and ages and ages, and the region that consistently comes up is Bordeaux. And the people from Bordeaux, the Bordelais, they created a technique that we call post-ferment maceration. And what it is when we're making a red wine, a lot of people don't realize, but if I squeeze a red grape, the juice and the pulp is actually white. So to make a red wine, I need to extract all that color from the skins. And so what I do is I ferment the wine with the skins, and that extracts all the color. And that process takes about 3 or 4 weeks. If I then leave that wine sitting with the skins and stems and seeds after the ferment, it's called post-ferment maceration. Now in Australia, we play around with 1-2 weeks to 1-2 months. In Bordeaux, they routinely leave it 12 to 18 months. And what this does is it solves 2 problems that we have when we're making wine, or when we're making a wine that's going to age and age and age. So the first problem we have when we're aging a wine is the fruit level. Imagine a normal wine might have a fruit level here. And as we age that wine, the fruit level drops and the savory level comes up, and the premium drinking is about when they're the same, which might be about here. That might be 10, 20 years. So if we want to get to 50 years, we need to start with a huge amount of stable fruit so that when it balances out, it's balancing out here, which is around about that 50 to 100 year mark. So that's the first problem we have when we're aging wine. The second problem we have when we're aging wine is a structural problem. And you know, when you get a really young Cabernet has that sort of, it's like chalky, edgy tannin. It sort of sticks to the side of the tongue and the mouth, and it coats the mouth, and it's got this angular sort of chalkiness to it. That angular chalky tannin is a short chain. And when we age a bottle of wine, those short chains join together into a long chain, and a long chain is nice and soft and velvety. So that's one of the good things that happen when we're aging a bottle of wine. Imagine I have a bottle and I've got 100 short chain tannins. And as we age it, those 100 short chains join to 50 long chains, which join to 25 really long chains. So I've got 25 beautiful, velvety, long chains, soft tannins in that wine. Unfortunately, 25 is not enough. And the whole structure of that wine falls apart. And it goes through a process we call cracking up. So this technique solves this problem. You have a tank of wine sitting there, and it's full with all these skins and stems and seeds for a really long time. And so you've got thousands and thousands of these short chain tannins floating around the tank, which forces them together into a long chain tannin. So when I bottle that wine, I'm bottling it with 100 long stable tannins rather than 100 short unstable tannins. And so that's how this technique solves that structural problem. The fruit problem, I have no idea how the French figured this out. At no stage when they're using this technique to make the wine, does the wine ever taste fruity. And I remember coming out, it would have been about 3 months, and I took a sample from the tap, I smelt it, and I tasted it, and I thought, oh my God, I have completely ruined this wine. It tastes absolutely disgusting. I remember calling some winemaking friends and some mentors in the industry. Hey guys, have you used this technique? You know, what happened? And they all said the exact same thing. They all said, oh, we tried that technique. Yes. And we got to 3 months. It tasted terrible. We pressed it off. We put it into oak. Don't worry, Jeff. You'll be able to blend the flavor off. Just press it off, put it in oak. You'll be able to blend the flavor out. And so I've got everyone in Australia saying, press it off. Everyone in France is saying, no, you've got to leave it 12 to 18 months. And so I decided I'd leave it. And I waited 12 months. It really wasn't that much better. And I waited 18 months, and I could really taste that those tannins had become soft and velvety. They really had polymerized out. I could really taste that. But there was no fruit-let flavor. It tasted like skins and seeds and stems. And I put it into oak, and I oaked it for 18 months. And then I remember putting it in the bottle. I remember bottling. I remember tasting this wine thinking, am I doing the right thing here? Am I about to end up with pallets of wine that I can't sell because they don't have any fruit character? They've only got this skinsy, seedy, stemsy character. And I thought, well, I've got the bottles. I've already started bottling. I may as well do it. So I did. And then about 12 months later in bottle, out of nowhere, there was this explosion of fruit. These really intense cassis, capsicum, tomato leaf, you know, those really cool climate Cabernet characters. And now I'm really excited about this wine because we have a 5-year-old Cabernet. It's still got intense capsicum and cassis, the tomato leaf. It's got those velvety tannins, and this wine is now doing exactly what the French said it would do. And so I am really excited about it. So in 50 years' time, we can all get back on Zoom and I can tell you whether this experiment worked or not. And it is an experiment because I have not met anyone in Australia to this day that has made a wine 18 months on skins. Wine Australia did a massive research project into it. and into post-ferment maceration. And that project went for 6 months. And that's because they got to that 3-month mark, they tasted it and analyzed it. They went to 4 months, tasted it, analyzed it. There was no difference. 5 months, no difference. 6 months, no difference. So they stopped the project. And I can tell you, after doing this, between 3 months and 12 months, nothing happened. Between 12 and 18, everything happened. And so what do the French say? 12 to 18. So there's something that's going on there. It's a wine I'm really excited about. It's still very much in that fruity spectrum. So at the moment, it's a great match for like a roast lamb. But I am very excited to see how this ages over the next 50 to 100 years, even if I make it that long. So we've got one more, and this is a cool one to end on. So the oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe. And it's dated 6000 BC. So that's 3,000 years before Egypt. So that's some serious wine history that's going on over in Georgia. And the Georgians make a very famous red style they call Kinsmarauli. And I'm going to put that up in the chat box because it's hard to spell. Kinsmarauli. And it's a very famous style over in Georgia. I was lucky enough to spend 7 years consulting in Georgia. So I do 6 months Australia, 6 months Georgia for 7 years. And this is my homage to the history of wine and homage to Georgia. It's my Australian version of Kinsmarauli. Kinsmarauli is a very famous style over there. I sell heaps of it to Russians and Eastern Europeans here. In 2006, when I was over there, I think it was 2006, the Russians and Georgians, actually it might have been before that. When did I have kids? 2011. So maybe 2006. The Russians and Georgians had that little battle, and the Russians put an embargo on all imports from Georgia, and it was still our biggest market. And we used to smuggle Kinsmarauli across the border on the school buses. So it's that famous over there. To describe it, I want to describe it as a Kinsmarauli, but it's kind of got the depth and complexity and Christmas cake character like a tawny port, but then it has that fresh, bright fruits character like a ruby port or a young red, but it doesn't have the alcohol. It's only 12% alcohol. So it's a really interesting wine to end on. It's a wine that I find is a great match with a mature cheddar or a dark chocolate. Or actually, my favorite match is, you know, that American style barbecue, that really smoky style barbecue. That's one of my favorite matches with the 8,000 vintages. But yeah, quite an interesting, fun wine to end on. And that is the last one I've got for you guys today. So thank you very much for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that I didn't bore you with my long stories of sheep and agricultural and regenerative farming and all that sort of thing. It is a passion. I get sidetracked sometimes. I would love you guys to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. These virtual experiences are really changed our business and something that we're going to keep doing forever. You know, it's not so easy, even pre-COVID, to be able to travel to all the areas that you want to see and taste all the wines that you have to that you want to taste. And so this gives us an opportunity to do that from the comfort of our own home. So we're going to continue to do these tastings. We've just launched a sparkling wine sessions where we're now doing these tastings in America as well. So if you've got friends in America, please let them know about this because they can do a virtual tasting with us. If you don't mind tasting early in the morning, you can even join them. It's a bit more civilized if your friends are in California, because I think 7 p.m. in California is about lunchtime for us. If they're in New York, on that side of the country, well, it's a little bit early. I think their 7 p.m. is about our 7 a.m. So it's a little bit early for us to taste the wine, but of course, you're still welcome to join your friends at the same time. If you do end up buying something, which of course I'd love to, I'll put a link up. I'd love you to. Please do not get confused. We may make good wines, but we have a terrible website. And so we're actually borrowing the website of Vincentia Cellars. So we process all our orders online through Vincentia Cellars. So please, guys, don't get confused if that's where you end up, because that is where you're meant to be. So guys, thanks very much. I will stay online for a little bit. So if anyone has any questions they want to put up, I'll probably mute out my my video and my talking, but I will still be here. So if you have any questions, chuck them up on the thing now. If you're here with some friends and you actually want to catch up with them a bit more, there is a link. If you go to the top, I might repost it for you. There's a link to our post-session live Zoom, and this will actually allow you to go live on Zoom and have a chat to each other and see each other and socialize a little bit more. We're kind of working on a solution to privacy in these public sessions and the ability to do video. And I think at the moment this kind of works, having the link at the end, because it still gives everyone their privacy whilst we're going. So guys, thanks very much. Have a fantastic weekend. Hopefully one day when borders are down and you can cross a border, we can have some visitors here in the Southern Highlands. You can come and meet our sheep. Until then, please follow us on Facebook and Instagram, watch our virtual tastings, and hopefully I'll see you sometime up here in the Highlands. So guys, thanks very much, and I'll stay on the chat for a little bit in case you want to ask any questions or leave any feedback. So thanks very much, guys.